hear it. That's silence before a storm, the kind that feels heavier than thunder, older than weather itself. Imagine a room lit only by candlelight, the flame trembling against stone walls as if even fire itself feared what it was illuminating. Now picture this. A family portrait hidden in the back of a Virginia manor, untouched for over 2 centuries. 11 figures stare out from that cracked canvas. Stiff collars, somber eyes, pale faces drained of warmth. At first glance, it's nothing more than another relic of the post-revolutionary aristocracy. But if you look closely, if you dare to hold that gaze for more than a few seconds, something shifts. The patriarch's hand, resting on the shoulder of a girl barely in her teens, is positioned not with tenderness, but with possession. And the girl, her eyes aren't the eyes of a daughter. They're the eyes of someone already claimed, already trained, already rewritten for a role she never chose. This is not just history. This is a crime written in bloodlines, sealed in church registers, hidden behind legal documents drafted by men who knew exactly what they were doing. You were never meant to hear this. They buried it for over 200 years. The church, the courts, the family archives, all conspired in silence. But here tonight you're going to see what was buried beneath their silence. A girl raised as both daughter and wife. And it wasn't an accident. It was by design. A psychological experiment wrapped in scripture, cloaked in the language of inheritance, executed with the cold precision of men who understood that control begins in the mind long before it touches the flesh. This is not just the story of one plantation or one family. It's a window into how power perpetuates itself, through obedience manufactured at home, through identities fractured until loyalty feels like love. Ask yourself, how does a child stop being a child? When does she forget what she should have been and instead accept what she was told to be? That's the darkness you're about to walk into, and once you hear it, you can't go back to the man you were before. So brace yourself. The next hour is not a story, it's a descent. A descent into a truth buried under tobacco fortunes, under biblical justifications, under a system that demanded obedience at any cost. Tonight we begin to exhume it, and I promise you, when you see how it begins, you'll understand why they tried to erase it. The year was 1776, a year men like to romanticize as the birth of liberty, but liberty is a word that always hides chains for someone else. In Virginia, the Caldwell estate stretched across thousands of acres, a kingdom carved from tobacco, sweat, and silence. Its master, Jonathan Caldwell, stood 6 feet tall with a voice that could silence a room and eyes sharp enough to strip a man of excuses. To neighbors, he was the embodiment of aristocracy, educated, wealthy, God-fearing. But behind his polished manners and calculated charm, something darker worked, something his ancestors had whispered about for generations. The family must never divide, no matter the cost. Jonathan had already buried a wife. Catherine Harrison Caldwell, of noble Jamestown lineage, had given him both status and wealth before dying in childbirth. He was left with no son, no heir, and no desire to share his empire with another woman who might bring her own loyalties, her own family's demands. For men like Jonathan, control was everything. To remarry meant compromise. To die without a successor meant ruin. So he searched for a solution not written in polite society, but in the shadows of scripture, in the grey areas of inheritance law, in the spaces where morality collapses under the weight of legacy. And fate, or design, delivered it. A storm, a carriage overturned on the Richmond Road, a family crushed beneath splintered wood and iron, 2 dead, 1 left behind, a girl no older than 11. She was delicate, trembling, her words educated, her bearing refined. She called herself Elizabeth Hartwell, orphaned in a night, carried into the manor by loyal servants, and placed in the care of a man whose mind was already sketching out her future. The moment Jonathan saw her, he knew. Her face echoed Catherine's, the same jaw, the same dark eyes, the same chestnut hair. It was as if fate had resurrected his wife, but younger, moldable, unprotected. The resemblance struck him like a revelation, and revelations for men like Jonathan are not accidents, they are commands. Neighbors would later say he acted from charity, taking in a lost child when no one else would. But charity was the mask. Behind closed doors, his hand was already on the quill, drafting letters that would never be sent, forging guardianship papers that would bind her to him. Within weeks, the girl was his, not just as a ward, but as property, a piece in a plan generations old. You see, this is how forbidden bonds are built. Not in sudden acts of madness, but in careful preparation, in papers filed with clerks who ask no questions, in scripture twisted until loyalty masquerades as divine duty. From the moment Elizabeth entered Millhaven, she was no longer a child of accident. She was an heir, a possession, and one day, a bride. The first months at Millhaven were dressed in kindness, but make no mistake, it was a kindness sharpened like a blade. Jonathan Caldwell understood the first law of control. You do not command a child into obedience, you guide her into dependence. And so Elizabeth, freshly orphaned, grieving, frightened, was given everything a girl might dream of. Dresses sewn from the finest fabrics, tutors from Richmond hired to fill her days with languages, mathematics and scripture, books imported from Europe, carefully selected, stacked like weapons disguised as gifts. She was never left cold, never left hungry. In every visible way she was cherished. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Jonathan began to seed her mind with truths rewritten in his own hand. At night, by the crackle of firelight, he would speak to her not as a father, but as a voice of destiny. He told her stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, men who bent the laws of flesh and family in the name of God's greater design. He explained that loyalty to family outweighed all other bonds, that sometimes what the world condemned, heaven required. And he repeated a phrase, almost like a prayer, until it burned itself into her memory. The family must remain united, at any cost. Isolation became her world. Letters from supposed relatives were intercepted. Requests to visit neighboring families were quietly denied. Her tutors, though skilled, were carefully chosen. Women past their youth, men of rigid faith, each instructed to reinforce Jonathan's vision. Elizabeth was being educated, yes, but she was also being conditioned. Every story of history she read, every parable she studied, every rule she absorbed, circled back to the same conclusion. She existed not for herself, but for the preservation of a name. And Jonathan knew how to tighten the leash without ever appearing to hold it. When she succeeded in her studies, he praised her not as an individual, but as a true Caldwell. When she faltered, he reminded her of her debt, that she had been spared when her parents were taken, that God had placed her in his hands for a reason, that she owed her life and future to him. Gratitude was weaponized, sculpted into obedience. By the time she reached 14, the girl who once wept for her parents had become something different. Her sorrow had been reshaped into loyalty. Her innocence was tethered to the estate, her destiny bound to a man who whispered scripture with one breath and forged contracts with the other. And still, no one outside Millhaven suspected. To the world, Elizabeth Hartwell was a rescued orphan. To Jonathan Caldwell, she was clay, being molded, shaped, prepared for the role no child should ever inherit. By the time Elizabeth turned 15, Jonathan Caldwell's plan was no longer an idea. It was architecture, and architecture, unlike fantasy, leaves evidence. He began to draw up the papers, carefully, quietly, in ink that still stains the surviving fragments of his ledger. The guardianship that made Elizabeth his ward was only the first step. Step 2 was inheritance. He petitioned the county court citing the uncertain future of the Caldwell line, and within weeks, a series of documents were signed that bound the estate not to blood, but to his discretion. In other words, Elizabeth could be written into the family as though she had always been there, her past erased, her identity remade. Jonathan also understood the power of rumor, so he planted whispers where they would grow most naturally. In the church pews. He donated heavily to the local parish, ensuring sermons bent subtly toward obedience, sacrifice, and the sanctity of keeping one's vows, no matter how unusual. The congregation nodded along, never realizing that these sermons were not for them, but for one girl sitting beside him, eyes downcast, absorbing every word like gospel. Behind closed doors, the documents darkened further. A secret covenant was drafted, written in Jonathan's sharp hand. Elizabeth Hartwell shall, upon reaching her 16th year, be joined in covenant to Jonathan Caldwell, that the estate remain whole, that the family remain united, and that the will of God be fulfilled. It was not filed with the court, not yet. It remained hidden in his study, bound in leather, a contract of sin masquerading as destiny. And Elizabeth, she didn't resist, not because she agreed, but because resistance had been trained out of her. For years, Jonathan had rewritten the script of her life until she no longer trusted her own thoughts. Gratitude, fear, dependence, obedience, all braided together until she believed that what she was being prepared for was not theft, but purpose. Neighbors, blind or complicit, saw only the surface, a wealthy man ensuring his estate would not splinter, an orphan given security and education. But beneath the veneer, a child was being erased, re-scripted into something that existed only to serve Jonathan's hunger for legacy. This is how corruption survives centuries, not in the chaos of violence, but in the paperwork of men who smile at church on Sunday while writing damnation into contracts on Monday. Jonathan Caldwell was not improvising. He was building, and his construction was almost complete. Elizabeth's 16th birthday was approaching, and with it, the unveiling of the truth she was never meant to escape. The night of Elizabeth's 16th birthday was staged like scripture. Jonathan Caldwell made certain of it. The great hall of Mill Haven was lit with dozens of candles, their flames trembling against gilt-framed portraits of ancestors who stared down like silent witnesses. The table was set not for guests but for ritual, silver-polished until it gleamed like moonlight, crystal glasses catching the flicker of firelight. No outsiders were invited, no neighbors, no friends, no extended family. Only Jonathan, Elizabeth, and a handful of servants who knew better than to see what was happening before them. Elizabeth wore white, not the silk of a bride, but the linen of purity, simple, modest, almost childlike. Jonathan had chosen it himself, claiming it was a symbol of her rebirth into the Caldwell line. She did not resist. She never had. Instead, she sat in silence as Jonathan raised a glass and delivered words that were not for her ears alone, but for the walls, for the bloodline, for the God he invoked as his accomplice. He spoke of unity, of keeping the estate whole, of sacrifices required by heaven and family alike. Every sentence circled back to his mantra: the family must remain united, no matter the cost. Then, in a moment that froze Elizabeth's heart, he placed a ring in her palm. Heavy, cold, engraved with the Caldwell crest. Not a gift, not a token, a mark. To the servants it was presented as inheritance, a girl's symbolic adoption into the Caldwell name. But Jonathan's eyes told the truth. This was no adoption, this was betrothal. And though no priest stood in that room, though no court recorded the covenant, the ritual bound Elizabeth as tightly as any law. After the toast, Jonathan took her hand and whispered the words he had planted in her mind for years. You were chosen. Your parents were taken so you could be given. You belong here. You belong to Omi. Elizabeth didn't answer. Her lips pressed shut, her breath shallow, her pulse racing beneath the weight of the ring. Somewhere inside her, a flicker of the girl she once was tried to cry out, but years of conditioning smothered the sound before it reached her throat. Gratitude chained her tongue. Obedience sealed it. That night, Mill Haven slept under silence. But silence is not peace. It is the sound of chains too subtle to hear, too sacred to question. Elizabeth Caldwell, for that was now her name, had been bound not in law, but in something far stronger, a ritual of obedience dressed as family. And Jonathan knew, once a vow is made in the mind, the body will follow. After the ritual of her 16th birthday, Mill Haven changed. The air itself felt heavier, as though the candles burned with less light and the walls leaned inward. Jonathan had no need to shout, no need to raise a hand, because now his claim over Elizabeth was no longer implied. It was ritualized, sacred, binding. Every breath she took, every step she made, was under his dominion. The estate became a cage with invisible bars. Elizabeth was no longer allowed to walk the grounds without escort. The gardens she once wandered freely were now too dangerous. The road into Richmond too corrupt. The only world she was permitted to know was the great house, the chapel, and Jonathan himself. Servants who had once spoken kindly to her now lowered their eyes, trained into silence by their master's warnings. She is mine to protect, mine to guide, mine to keep. and Jonathan's control grew darker. Each evening, scripture lessons turned into interrogations. He asked her to repeat the verses he had drilled into her mind, twisting holy words until they became shackles. Obedience as virtue, silence as duty, unity as salvation. If she hesitated, even for a moment, he punished her not with violence but with withdrawal. Hours of cold silence, days without acknowledgement, a void of affection that left her desperate for his approval. It worked. Within weeks, Elizabeth found herself speaking in Jonathan's words, repeating his truths, censoring her own thoughts before they ever left her lips. Gratitude was no longer something she felt. It was something she performed desperately to earn the smallest flicker of his approval. But the deepest cruelty was isolation. Jonathan began sending servants away, dismissing them for trivial infractions until only the most loyal remained. Those who had nowhere else to go, those who feared him more than they pitied her. Elizabeth had no companions, no peers, no voices but his. The silence of Millhaven became absolute. And yet, in that silence, a shadow began to stir inside her, small, faint, but alive. The more Jonathan pressed his truths into her, the more a quiet fracture spread through her mind. She did not speak of it. She did not even dare name it. But sometimes, late at night, staring into the dark of her chamber, she felt it, the sense that something inside her was slipping away, and something else, something colder, was being born in its place. Jonathan believed he was molding her into obedience. What he did not see was that he was also creating something far more dangerous, a mind that could survive anything, even him. Jonathan Caldwell believed his design was flawless. He thought Elizabeth had been broken, reshaped, sanctified into his image, but in truth, something else was happening, something he never accounted for. Obedience became her mask. She learned quickly that resistance brought silence, and silence was unbearable. So she smiled when he praised her. She bowed her head when he invoked scripture. She repeated his words with perfect devotion, as though they were her own. To the servants who remained, she seemed the very image of a dutiful daughter. Pious, quiet, unwavering. To Jonathan, she was proof that his methods had succeeded. But inside, in the private corridors of her mind, Elizabeth was no longer the girl he thought he controlled. She had stopped fighting against his truths. Instead, she began memorizing them with precision, studying every phrase, every rule, every parable he twisted. Not because she believed them, but because she understood something he never imagined she could. Knowledge was survival. If she could think his thoughts, speak his words, move in his rhythm, then he would never see the fracture growing behind her eyes. And so she became two people. By day, the obedient ward, clothed in linen, head bowed in prayer. By night, alone in her chamber, she whispered not to God, but to herself. She recited his scriptures backward. She rewrote his words in secret notebooks, turning commandments into questions, vows into riddles. She studied him as though he were one of the Latin texts her tutors had once placed in her hands. Patiently, methodically, she began to map his weaknesses, his hunger for legacy, his need for obedience, his obsession with secrecy. What Jonathan mistook for submission was, in truth, apprenticeship. She was learning the language of control from the master himself, and each day she wore the mask of the perfect Caldwell, the sharper H. Her hidden self became. By the time her 17th year approached, Elizabeth was no longer a child, no longer the orphan plucked from ruin. She was something colder, something forged in silence and scripture, in fear and fire. Jonathan believed he had bound her to his will forever, but what he had really done was awaken a creature he could never unmake. For years, Millhaven had stood apart, its gates closed, its windows shuttered, its master hidden in his own rituals. Outsiders accepted this silence because the Caldwells had always been different. Wealth excused secrecy, power excused absence, but as Elizabeth grew into womanhood, silence became suspicion. It began in the parish pews. Women whispered behind gloved hands, noting how Elizabeth no longer sat among the other girls her age. She did not court, she did not laugh, she did not even look up from her hymnal. Always beside Jonathan, always dressed in white, her presence was unsettling in a way no one could quite name. A daughter, a ward, a wife, the lines blurred, and the blurring itself became scandal. Farmers at the market muttered that the Caldwell master had grown more controlling, more severe, dismissing long-time servants without reason. Merchants wondered why Elizabeth was never seen without Jonathan at her side, as though she were less a ward and more a possession. Rumours spread like smoke, faint, then thick, impossible to contain. One Sunday during communion, a neighbour finally gave voice to the unease. As Jonathan guided Elizabeth down the aisle, her head bowed, a woman leaned toward her husband and whispered too loudly, "That girl does not walk like a child, she walks like a bride." The words struck like a bell, heads turned, eyes followed. Jonathan felt it, the weight of suspicion pressing against him for the first time. His hand tightened on Elizabeth's arm, his smile colder than the stained glass light. Back at Millhaven, his paranoia ignited. He forbade Elizabeth from attending church for several weeks, claiming illness. He dismissed another servant, fearful of loose tongues. He reinforced the gates, instructing the guards to allow no visitors unannounced. The estate grew darker, more isolated, until it resembled not a home, but a fortress. But walls cannot keep out whispers. The town's unease grew, and with it came the first hints of danger for Jonathan's design. For when communities sense corruption, they do not forget. They wait, they watch, they sharpen their questions. And all the while, Elizabeth remained silent. She wore the mask he had given her, but inside, she heard the murmurs too. And though she did not yet act, she understood something Jonathan never would. Suspicion is a seed. Given time, it grows. The whispers outside the gates gnawed at Jonathan like rats at the foundation of his house. Every rumor carried the threat of exposure. Every side glance from the townsfolk felt like a blade against his legacy. He could not allow it. He would not allow it. So he turned deeper into ritual. Evenings that had once been filled with scripture readings stretched into midnight ceremonies. Jonathan began demanding Elizabeth kneel before him in the chapel, repeating vows of obedience not once, but again and again, until her voice cracked under the strain. He scrawled new commandments in his own hand, distortions of holy verse, rewritten to bind her tighter to his will. He made her memorize them, word for word, as if her very salvation depended on it. A house divided is a house condemned. The blood of the Caldwell line is holy, and it must remain pure. Obedience is worship, disobedience is sin. These became her catechisms, whispered until they filled the silence of Millhaven like a second heartbeat. Jonathan's paranoia seeped into every corner of the estate. He locked away correspondence, forbade Elizabeth from seeing even the remaining servants without him present, and nailed the shutters closed in her chamber so that she could no longer gaze at the outside world. The house darkened, the air thickened, and Elizabeth's world narrowed to a single figure. Him. But Jonathan mistook silence for surrender. What he did not see, what he could not imagine, was that Elizabeth's mind was no longer breaking. It was hardening. She endured the endless ceremonies with the stillness of stone, her face serene, her eyes lowered, but inside, each repetition carved something sharp into her. Each vow, each false scripture, each twisted ritual became another lesson, another weapon, another brick in the fortress she was building within herself. Jonathan believed he was sanctifying purifying her, binding her. In truth, he was teaching her how to wear chains so convincingly that no one, not even her captor, could see she was preparing to break them. And if Jonathan was becoming a priest of his own madness, then Elizabeth was becoming something far more dangerous, a disciple with the patience to outlive him. It was the priest who came first. For weeks, Jonathan had kept Elizabeth from the parish, claiming she was ill, claiming she was too weak to attend. But absence itself is a kind of presence, and in the small towns of Virginia, silence only sharpens curiosity. The murmurs grew louder until Father Alcott, the parish priest, resolved to pay a visit. He arrived at Millhaven on a damp autumn morning, the mist curling through the trees like smoke. The iron gates creaked open reluctantly, and the guards led him to the great house where Jonathan waited, all charm and false warmth. "Father," Jonathan said smoothly, extending a hand, "what a blessing to see you here. You honor my house." But Alcott's eyes were sharp. He had baptized Elizabeth as a girl, had seen her grow, bright, curious, alive. And now, as Jonathan ushered him inside, he noticed the silence that clung to the corridors, the way servants slipped past like ghosts, the way the house seemed not alive, but embalmed. And then she appeared. Elizabeth, pale in her white linen dress, her eyes lowered, her hands folded in front of her. To an untrained gaze, she looked the image of purity. But Alcott was not untrained. He saw the way Jonathan's hand gripped her arm a moment too tightly. He saw how she flinched when Jonathan's voice deepened, how she did not speak unless spoken to. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The priest tried to ask questions about her health, her studies, her spirit, but Jonathan answered for her every time. Elizabeth only nodded, only whispered, "Yes, Father," or "I am well." The mask was flawless, yet to Alcott it was too flawless. He had heard that kind of silence before, in women whose spirits had been broken under the weight of men who cloaked their cruelty in scripture. When he rose to leave, Jonathan insisted on walking him to the gate. "You must forgive her shyness," Jonathan said, his smile cold as stone. "She is still being shaped." Alcott said nothing, but as he mounted his horse and rode back into the mist, he knew this. Mill Haven was not merely a house of wealth, it was a prison, and the girl within was not safe. The priest carried with him the first true spark of confrontation. He did not yet know how, nor when, but he knew he would return. The moment the priest's horse vanished into the mist, Jonathan's mask shattered. He stormed back into the house, the echo of his boots rattling through the silent halls. Elizabeth was waiting in the chapel as he had ordered, kneeling before the altar. Her hands were clasped, her head bowed. To any eye she was prayer itself, pure and unshaken. But Jonathan was not any eye. He saw weakness where there was none. He saw betrayal in her silence, rebellion in her stillness. "You let him doubt," Jonathan hissed, his voice low, his hands trembling with rage. "You let him see cracks in what I have built." Elizabeth said nothing. She kept her head lowered, her hands folded, as though the words could pass over her like storm winds. But silence did not soothe him. It enraged him. Jonathan seized her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. "Do you think they will save you? Do you think anyone beyond these gates understands what you are? You are mine, Elizabeth, mine. No priest, no neighbor, no whisper will change that." He dragged her toward the altar, forcing her down against the cold stone. With a knife from his coat, not raised to cut but to terrify, he carved his distorted scripture into the wood beside her face, each word punctuated by his fury. "Obedience is worship. Disobedience is sin." He pressed the knife against her palm, not breaking skin, but letting the cold metal burn its warning. "Repeat it," he ordered. Elizabeth's voice was steady, though soft. "Obedience is worship. Disobedience is sin." Again, louder, until the chapel walls carried her voice like a chant, until Jonathan's rage subsided into trembling triumph. And when at last he left her there, alone in the dark, the knife-marked scripture etched into the altar, Elizabeth did not cry. She did not shake. She pressed her palm against the cold wood, tracing the grooves he had carved. Jonathan, though, says, he had branded her. In truth, he had given her another lesson, another scar to memorize, another line in the gospel of survival she was writing in silence. That night, after Jonathan's fury had burned itself into silence, Elizabeth remained in the chapel. The house slept, but she did not. She knelt where he had forced her, her hand resting on the scarred altar, the knife's words glinting faintly in the candlelight. Obedience is worship. Disobedience is sin. He believed he had carved chains, but Elizabeth saw something else. Proof. Proof that his faith was no longer God's but his own. Proof that his scripture was not holy, but man-made, and man-made things could be broken. Slowly, carefully, she slid her sleeve across the wood, smearing the fresh carvings with wax and soot from the candle flame. The words blurred. They did not disappear, not entirely, but they were no longer sharp, no longer perfect. It was a small act, almost invisible. Jonathan might never notice, but to Elizabeth, it was everything. It was the first time she had undone him, however slightly. Later, in her chamber, she hid scraps of parchment beneath the floorboards, stolen fragments from Jonathan's desk. On them she copied his twisted verses, but not as he had written them. She altered them, word by word, until their meanings inverted. Obedience is worship became obedience is blindness. Disobedience is sin became disobedience is freedom. Each line she wrote was like a match struck in the darkness, small, flickering, but alive. Jonathan, in his arrogance, believed he had broken her, that she was clay in his hands, silent and pliant. But clay, when fired in heat, does not stay soft. It hardens, it endures. And though Elizabeth still wore the mask he demanded, still bowed her head, still whispered the prayers he forced into her, beneath that mask a new scripture was taking form, a scripture written not in submission, but in secret rebellion. It was only ink for now, only words hidden beneath floorboards. But every fire begins with something small, and Elizabeth had begun to burn. Mill Haven had always cast a shadow, but now that shadow began to stretch across the town itself. The servants who had once worked in the great house spoke in hushed tones at the tavern. Some claimed they had seen Elizabeth only once in months, her face pale as porcelain, her steps guided by Jonathan's hand as though she were a puppet. Others swore they heard strange sounds from the chapel at night, chanting, weeping, the scrape of furniture dragged across stone. No one had proof. But in a place as small as Caldwell Parish, proof was not required. Whispers were enough. Mothers began warning their daughters not to linger near the Caldwell estate. Men muttered that Jonathan had become something more than a landowner, something darker, something that fed not on harvest or labor, but on silence. And then came the children. They spoke of a woman at the window, pale, unmoving, her hand pressed against the glass. They swore she looked down at them as they passed through the misted fields, her eyes following them like a ghost. Some said it was Elizabeth. Others said it was not Elizabeth at all, but something else wearing her face. By winter, even the elders, men who had once done business with Jonathan, began to cross the street when he came riding into town. They still tipped their hats, still forced their greetings, but beneath every word was fear. It was not yet rebellion, not yet confrontation. But the air around Mill Haven had changed. The people no longer saw the estate as untouchable, nor its master as holy. The seed of doubt had taken root, and Jonathan Caldwell, for all his arrogance, could feel it pressing in. He knew eyes were turning toward him. He knew the silence outside the gates was no longer the silence of obedience, but of plotting. And that knowledge, that gnawing dread, would drive him deeper into the rituals that chained Elizabeth to his will. Jonathan Caldwell was no fool. He heard the whispers, felt the weight of the stairs when he rode into town. He knew the air was turning, that respect had soured into unease. And so, he did what men like him had always done. He cloaked himself in God. One Sunday morning, Mill Haven's gates swung wide for the first time in months. Invitations had gone out to every family in Caldwell Parish, penned in Jonathan's elegant script. He called it a gathering of prayer, a chance to renew the covenant of faith and community. The people came, out of fear, out of curiosity, out of the hunger to glimpse what lay behind the estate's iron bars. They arrived in their finest clothes, children clutching their mothers' skirts, men tipping hats but keeping their eyes sharp. Jonathan greeted them like a benevolent patriarch. His voice boomed through the courtyard, warm, commanding, righteous. Brothers and sisters, the Lord has blessed us, and we gather today to honor his word. And then Elizabeth appeared. Dressed in white, her hair braided simply, her face pale as bone, she walked to his side with the grace of a bride. She lowered her head, folded her hands, and let Jonathan lead her before the crowd. To the townsfolk, she was the picture of holiness, but those who looked closer, the mothers especially, saw something else. They saw the stiffness of her smile, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way Jonathan's hand never left her arm. Still, the performance was masterful. Hymns were sung, scripture was read. Jonathan delivered a sermon that dripped with humility and grandeur alike. He spoke of obedience, of the sanctity of family, of women as vessels of divine will. And the people, though unsettled, nodded. Who among them would dare accuse a man who spoke with such conviction, who stood beneath the cross with such fire? The gathering ended with wine and bread, laughter force, but loud enough to echo through the hills, and when the townsfolk returned home, their whispers were quieter. Doubt remained, yes, But Jonathan had bought himself time. He had built another mask, this one for the entire town, and only Elizabeth, standing silent at his side, knew how fragile it truly was. The moment the last guest had departed and the gates clanged shut, Jonathan's smile vanished. Elizabeth had played her part flawlessly. She had walked, knelt, and prayed exactly as he demanded. She had been his ornament of purity, his proof before the parish that his household was holy. But Jonathan was not satisfied. In the chapel's dim light, with the echoes of him still clinging to the rafters, he dragged Elizabeth to the altar once more. His hands shook, not with weakness, but with the fever of a man who believed himself God's chosen vessel. "You see what I have done?" he growled, his breath hot against her ear. "You see how they believe, and yet—" He slammed his fist against the wood. "Yet you trembled. They saw it. I saw it." Elizabeth remained silent. That silence enraged him more than words ever could. He forced her to kneel on the cold stone, pressing her down until her knees bruised against the floor. He made her recite his twisted scripture until her voice cracked. And when her voice broke, he struck her, not in wild rage, but with deliberate, measured cruelty, each blow an act of devotion in his mind. "Every mark," he hissed, "is a reminder. Every scar, a covenant. You will not betray me with your eyes, Elizabeth. You will not." But Jonathan, in his fury, failed to see what was happening in the silence between his blows. Elizabeth was learning. Each command, each punishment, each carved word and forced prayer was not breaking her. It was teaching her exactly how his mind worked, how his rituals built themselves, how his faith twisted into violence. He thought he was branding obedience into her flesh, but what he was really doing was giving her a map of his weakness, his obsession, his hunger for control. And Elizabeth, though battered, though trembling, was memorizing every line of it. For weeks Elizabeth endured. She bent when he demanded it. She prayed when he commanded it. She recited his scripture until her lips were numb. But then, one night, she chose to change the words. It was subtle, deliberate. Jonathan had forced her to kneel in the chapel once more, his knife pressed to the altar as he demanded she speak. "Obedience is worship," he ordered. Elizabeth lowered her head. Her voice was steady, almost meek. "Obedience is salvation." Jonathan paused. His eyes flickered. It was not what he had told her to say, but it was close enough. Close enough to sound obedient, yet strange enough to stir his pride. He believed she had expanded his teaching, made it more profound. And for the first time, he smiled. That smile was everything. It told Elizabeth what she had suspected all along. Jonathan's faith was not about God, it was about Jonathan. His hunger was not for obedience alone, but for affirmation. To hear his words echoed back to him, twisted into something greater, something eternal. So she gave him more. "Disobedience is sin," he commanded. "Disobedience," she whispered, "is the sin that makes the faithful stronger." He closed his eyes, trembling with something close to ecstasy. He thought her submission had blossomed into understanding. He thought she was beginning to believe. But Elizabeth was not believing. She was feeding him. She was planting words like hooks into his rituals, guiding his delusion in directions he did not realize. Each night, each chant, each prayer she altered slightly, carefully, never enough for him to question, just enough for him to believe that his scripture was evolving, becoming divine. And with every change, Jonathan drew closer to the edge of madness. Elizabeth had learned his hunger, and now she was learning how to starve him, or poison him. By spring, the mask Jonathan had crafted was beginning to crack. The townsfolk still remembered his grand display of piety, the gathering at Millhaven where Elizabeth appeared as his perfect bride of faith. But memories fade quickly when fed with silence, and silence was all that poured from the Caldwell estate. The children still spoke of the pale figure at the window. Farmers swore they saw lantern light moving in the chapel long after midnight, shadows dancing like spectres against the glass. And the women whispered loudest of all. "He holds her prisoner," some said. "She is ill," said others. But the most chilling whisper of all was this: "She is not Elizabeth anymore." By now, small acts of defiance had begun to stir. Bread deliveries to the estate slowed. Servants no longer stayed through the night. When Jonathan rode into town, fewer hats were tipped, fewer greetings spoken. Even the sheriff, once his loyal ally, avoided his eye. At the tavern, over mugs of sour ale, the talk grew bolder. Men spoke of marching to the gates, of forcing Jonathan to show them his wife, but always fear crept back in. Fear of Jonathan's influence, his wealth, his voice that could still turn scripture into iron. It was the women who carried the whispers forward, spreading them from kitchen to market to church pew. And in those whispers was a question, repeated often enough to feel like a curse. If Elizabeth Caldwell was still alive, why had no one heard her voice? The parish was no longer content with silence. They wanted truth, and the truth was rattling Millhaven's gates, pressing against its walls like a storm waiting to break. Jonathan could feel it, and Elizabeth could hear it too. For the first time, she realized something. She was not entirely alone. The parish had grown restless, but it was Father Alcott who gave their unease a voice. He had vanished for weeks, traveling under the pretense of visiting another diocese. But in truth, he had gone in search of what he already suspected, that Jonathan Caldwell's faith was not born of scripture, but of corruption. And when he returned, he did not return empty-handed. Late one evening, the church bells tolled, summoning the faithful. The townsfolk gathered, weary from labor yet curious at the urgency in the priest's summons. Father Alcott stood at the altar, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried. A ledger. It was old, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with Jonathan's careful script. Not scripture, not sermons, but names. Dozens of them. Names of servants, names of tenants, and beside each name, a mark, a date, a cross, or a circle. The ledger reeked of something foul, something ritualistic. Some names had been struck through entirely as though erased from existence. Alcott's voice broke as he spoke. These are not records of business. These are not the ledgers of trade. These are records of blood. Gasps filled the church. Mothers clutched their children. Men muttered darkly, the unease that had simmered now catching flame. It was proof enough to stir the parish. Proof that Jonathan was no holy man, but something else, something dangerous, something that thrived in secrecy. But Alcott was not done. From his pocket, he drew a torn scrap of cloth, stained with something brown and stiff. He held it high before the flickering candles. This, he said, voice hardening, was found near the chapel at Millhaven. It belonged to a girl who vanished last winter, and Jonathan Caldwell told us she left the parish. Silence. And then the silence broke, not with prayer, but with anger. The townsfolk had their proof, and Jonathan Caldwell had enemies at his gate. Jonathan Caldwell knew before the townsfolk ever lit their lanterns. Whispers travelled fast in Caldwell Parish, but faster still within the walls of Millhaven. A loyal servant brought word to Jonathan before midnight. Father Alcott had spoken. He had shown the ledger. He had turned the parish against him. Jonathan did not rage. He did not curse. He simply stood in silence, his jaw clenched, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he kept always at his side. Then slowly, he smiled. They think they have found my sins, he whispered, but they have only found my offering. That night he dragged Elizabeth once more to the chapel, but this time the room was changed. The altar was stripped bare, the pews overturned. Candles burned black with smoke, filling the chamber with a choking haze. Elizabeth's body was weak, her spirit frayed, yet she sensed something final in the way Jonathan moved. Not with the rehearsed cruelty of his rituals, but with the desperation of a man cornered. He bound her wrists to the altar, tighter than ever before, the ropes cutting into her skin. His voice thundered against the stone walls, not measured scripture, but a frantic chant that spilled from him in broken fragments. They come for me, Elizabeth. They come with torches and lies. But we will be delivered, you and I. Tonight, they will see God's hand upon us. He lifted the knife high, its blade glinting in the candlelight. This was no ritual of correction. This was sacrifice. Elizabeth's heart pounded, not with fear alone, but with something sharper. She realized the truth at last. Jonathan was not preparing to kill her. He was preparing to transcend through her, to use her blood as his final sermon, his last proof of divinity. And outside, faint but growing, came the sound of voices. The parish was moving. Jonathan raised the blade. Elizabeth stared into his eyes, and the world held its breath. The chapel shook with the sound of footsteps. The parish was at the gates, their voices rising like thunder, but Jonathan heard none of it. His world had narrowed to the altar, the knife, and the trembling body of his bride. He pressed the blade to Elizabeth's chest, his eyes wild with a fever that looked almost holy. "With your blood," he whispered, "I will ascend." And then Elizabeth spoke. Her voice was soft, ragged from nights of forced prayer, but steady, calm. "Ascension comes through surrender." Jonathan froze. The words struck him like scripture. He leaned closer, desperate to hear, to believe. Elizabeth's lips curled into the faintest smile. "And you, Jonathan, have never known how to surrender." In that moment, her body shifted, sudden, deliberate. She twisted against the ropes, enough to drive the blade off course. Jonathan staggered forward, the knife slipping in his grip. For the first time, his certainty cracked. The doors burst open. Dozens of townsfolk flooded the chapel, led by Father Alcott with a lantern raised high. The smoke, the overturned pews, the bound woman on the altar. It was not scripture they witnessed, but madness. Jonathan turned on them, knife dripping with blood where it had nicked Elizabeth's skin. His voice roared, desperate. You see her sacrifice. She is proof of my covenant." But the parish did not kneel. They did not believe. Elizabeth's voice rose above his, hoarse yet unyielding. "He is no prophet. He is no man of God. He is only Jonathan Caldwell, and he bleeds like any other." In the struggle that followed, Jonathan fought like a man possessed, but it ended as quickly as it began. The knife was torn from his hand. His body was thrown down before the altar he had built of lies. And as the parish watched, Father Alcott spoke the final words. "No man can build a church upon blood." Silence fell, the patent. Candles guttered out, and Jonathan Caldwell, the false prophet, the master of Millhaven, was dragged into the darkness he had once commanded. Elizabeth, bruised and broken, was lifted from the altar. She did not smile, she did not weep, she only stared at the place where Jonathan had stood, her silence louder than any prayer. The parish had their truth, but the scars of Millhaven would never heal.